close your eyes and picture a medieval tavern. You see it, don't you? The warm glow of a crackling hearth. Jovial patrons clinking pewter tankards filled with foaming ale. A bard strumming a lute in the corner, singing ballads of chivalry and courtly love. Serving wenches with rosy cheeks and clean aprons, carrying platters of roasted meat to tables of laughing knights. The air perfumed with wood smoke and roasting venison. A sanctuary from the outside world, cozy and welcoming, where adventurers plot quests and nobles conspire over goblets of honeyed mead. Now open your eyes. And forget everything you just imagined. Because that tavern, the one Hollywood built, the one fantasy novel sold you, the one video games rendered in warm polygons and ambient sound, never existed. It is a lie. A comforting fiction constructed by centuries of romantic nostalgia, by people who never had to endure the medieval world and therefore could afford to sentimentalize it. The truth is darker, filthier, more violent, more desperate, and infinitely more human. Welcome to the real medieval tavern. The year is 1347. The place is London, though it could just as easily be Paris, Cologne, Florence, or any of the teeming cities of 14th century Europe. It is evening, the hour when darkness falls like a shroud over streets slick with mud and sewage. You are cold. You are hungry. And if you are traveling, or working, or simply trying to survive another day in a world where plague and starvation are never more than one bad harvest away, you need shelter. You need sustenance. You need, desperately, a place to sit down and drink something that will not kill you. So you enter the tavern. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not the pleasant aroma of baking bread or roasting meat. No. This is an olfactory assault, a physical blow to the senses that makes your eyes water and your stomach lurch. It is the smell of unwashed bodies, 30, 40, perhaps 50 people crammed into a space designed for half that number, none of whom have bathed in months because bathing is considered medically dangerous. A practice that opens the pores and allows disease to enter the body. It is the smell of wood smoke from the central fire, thick and acrid, with no chimney to vent it properly, filling the room with a haze that stings your throat. It is the smell of tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, sputtering and guttering in wall sconces, giving off a greasy, rancid odor. And beneath all of that, permeating everything, is the smell of the floor. The floor of a medieval tavern was not wooden planks, swept clean each evening. It was not stone, mopped with water and vinegar. It was covered in rushes, reeds and grasses strewn across the packed earth to absorb spills and provide a modicum of insulation. These rushes were changed infrequently, sometimes only twice a year. Into them fell everything: spilled ale, vomit, food scraps, animal bones gnawed clean and tossed aside, the drippings from chamber pots that patrons were too drunk or too lazy to take outside, the blood from fights, the excrement of the tavern's dogs and cats and rats. The rushes composted. They fermented. They became a living ecosystem of rot and decay, home to fleas and lice and beetles and things that had no name but knew instinctively that the tavern floor was paradise. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great Renaissance humanist, visited England in the early 16th century and was so appalled by the state of tavern floors that he wrote about them at length, describing them as repositories of everything that is nasty: spittle, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, the dregs of beer, the remains of fish, and other nameless filth. And Erasmus was writing about the improved conditions of the Renaissance, after decades of sanitary reform. In the 14th century it was worse. Much worse. So you stand in the doorway, breathing through your mouth, waiting for your eyes to adjust to the smoke-dimmed interior lit by the inadequate glow of tallow candles and the sullen red embers of the central hearth. Gradually, shapes resolve into people. Figures hunched over rough-hewn tables. Faces illuminated in flashes as someone moves past the fire. Eyes watching you with suspicion, calculation, hostility. Because you are a stranger. And in the medieval world, strangers are threats. The tavern is not one thing but many, a hierarchy of establishments each serving a different stratum of society. At the top are the inns, substantial buildings with multiple rooms, stables for horses, and a reputation to maintain. Inns catered to wealthy merchants, minor nobility, and the occasional bishop traveling on church business. They serve wine imported from Gascony or the Rhineland, offer private chambers where one can sleep without fear of being robbed or murdered in the night, and employ literate clerks who can arrange for letters to be sent or bills of exchange to be honored. You cannot afford an inn. Below the inns are the taverns proper, establishments licensed to sell wine as well as ale, frequented by successful craftsmen, guild members, prosperous traders. Taverns occupy the middle ground, respectable enough that a merchant's wife might occasionally be seen there, drinking watered wine and discussing the price of wool, but rough enough that violence is always a possibility. And below the taverns are the alehouses. Humble, often unlicensed establishments run out of private homes, usually by women, the Alewives who brewed the ale that was the lifeblood of medieval society. Alehouses are where the laborers drink, where the poor gather, where soldiers on leave spend their meager pay, where the margins of society, the drifters and gamblers and thieves and prostitutes, congregate because nowhere else will have them. This is where you are. An alehouse in the Southwark district of London, across the Thames from the city proper, in the liberty of the Bishop of Winchester where the city's laws do not quite reach and the darkness is deeper. You push your way to the bar, a simple wooden counter, scarred and stained, and catch the eye of the alewife, a woman perhaps 40 years old, which makes her ancient by medieval standards. Her face is hard, weathered by years of smoke and labor, her hands calloused and strong. She does not smile. She does not welcome you. She waits for you to speak, to order, to produce the coin that will determine whether you are served or thrown back into the street. Ale, you say. She nods. Dips a wooden tankard into a barrel behind the counter. Pours a measure of thick, brownish liquid that bears only superficial resemblance to the clear, carbonated beer of the modern world. Slides the tankard across to you. Waits. You produce a penny. She takes it, bites it to verify it is genuine silver and not a counterfeit, then pockets it without comment. You drink. The ale is flat, slightly sour, with a yeasty texture and a faint undertone of mold. But it is wet, and it contains alcohol, and alcohol is survival. In the medieval world, alcohol was not recreation. It was not vice. It was necessity, as essential to survival as bread, as fundamental to daily life as air itself. Because water would kill you. Not immediately, perhaps. Not with the certainty of poison. But drink from the wrong well, the wrong stream, the wrong communal cistern, and within hours you would be doubled over with cramps, voiding your bowels in liquid agony, burning with fever as cholera or dysentery or any of a dozen waterborne diseases ravaged your body. In a world without germ theory, without understanding of pathogens or sanitation, the connection between water and illness was observed but not comprehended. Water was simply known to be dangerous, especially in cities where wells were sunk too close to cesspits, where rivers served as both water source and sewer, where the concept of treating water before drinking it did not exist. Alcohol, by contrast, was safe. The brewing process, boiling water to create wort, fermenting it with yeast, killed the microorganisms that caused disease. Medieval people did not understand why this worked, but they understood that it did. Ale and beer and wine were medicine disguised as drink, hydration that would not result in death. And so everyone drank. Children as young as 3 or 4 consumed weak ale with their breakfast. Pregnant women drank ale throughout their pregnancies. Monks in monasteries were allotted a gallon of ale per day as part of their rations. Laborers working in fields drank ale at mid-morning, at midday, and again in the evening. The average adult consumed between 2 and 3 liters of ale daily, not because they were drunk, but because they were alive and wished to remain so. The ale served in medieval alehouses was not strong by modern standards, perhaps 2 to 3% alcohol by volume, roughly equivalent to a modern light beer. But it was thick with nutrients, unfiltered, full of yeast and grains, more akin to liquid bread than to the clear beverages we know today. It was food as much as drink, a source of calories and vitamins in a diet often desperately lacking both. Wine was different. Wine was luxury. Imported from Gascony, from Burgundy, from the sun-drenched vineyards of southern Europe, wine was expensive, a marker of status and wealth. The merchant drinking wine at a proper tavern was advertising his success, demonstrating that he could afford imported goods, that he moved in circles where French vintages were discussed and appreciated. Wine was power made liquid, class distinction poured into a goblet. But here, in this alehouse in Southwark, there is no wine. Only ale, served in battered wooden tankards to men and women who have nothing but need. You find a space at one of the long communal tables. There are no private tables, no booths, no illusion of personal space. You sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, your back to the room because all the wall-facing seats are taken, occupied by men who arrived earlier and claimed the defensible positions. You set your tankard down carefully, making sure it does not spill, because every drop represents currency you can ill afford to waste. Around you, the tavern churns with activity and tension. At the far end of the table, a group of laborers, stonemasons by the white dust on their clothes, are eating from wooden bowls, spooning up thick grayish-brown sludge that they seem to find adequate if not appetizing. This is pottage, the staple food of the medieval lower classes, and its preparation is an object lesson in medieval attitudes toward hygiene and food safety. Pottage is a stew. But not a stew in the modern sense, prepared fresh for each meal and consumed within hours. No, pottage is a perpetual stew, kept simmering in a large iron cauldron over the fire day and night, for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Into this cauldron goes everything, vegetables when available, onions, leeks, turnips, whatever is in season and cheap. Grains, barley, oats, rye, to thicken the broth. Meat, when it can be afforded, though meat is a generous term for the scraps and offal that find their way into the pot, chicken necks, pig trotters, the tougher cuts of mutton, bones with a few shreds of flesh still clinging to them. And because the cauldron is never fully emptied, because new ingredients are simply added to what remains, pottage acquires a kind of geological stratigraphy, layers of meals compounding upon one another, the flavors of yesterday and the day before and last week all simmering together in a rich, bacterial ecosystem. Is it safe? By modern standards, absolutely not. By medieval standards, it is cooked, which is the only standard that matters. The heat kills most of the dangerous organisms. Most. Not all. But hunger is more immediate than the vague possibility of food poisoning, and so the pottage is eaten, ladled into bowls, sopped up with coarse bread, and washed down with ale. You watch the masons eat. One of them catches you staring and glares back, hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. You look away quickly, staring down into your ale. Lesson learned: in the tavern, curiosity is dangerous. Mind your own business. Draw no attention. Survive the night. But survival is complicated by the fact that the tavern is not merely a place to eat and drink. It is a social nexus, the communal living room of medieval society, the only space where people from different walks of life are forced into proximity. And proximity breeds friction. At a table near the fire, a group of soldiers drink with grim determination, their laughter too loud, too forced. They wear the king's livery, or what remains of it after months of campaign. They have returned from France, from the 100 Years' War, from battles where they saw their friends cut down by arrows and dysentery, where they participated in atrocities that no amount of ale can wash from memory. Today we would call it PTSD. In the 14th century it has no name, only symptoms: the sudden violence, the nightmares, the inability to reintegrate into civilian life, the sense that the world of peace is somehow less real than the world of war. They are dangerous. Everyone knows it. The other patrons give them a wide berth, speak quietly when the soldiers are near, avoid eye contact. The alewife serves them without comment, takes their coin, and retreats to a safe distance. At another table, a group of pilgrims, or men claiming to be pilgrims, play at dice, their game accompanied by curses and accusations of cheating. Pilgrimage is theoretically a religious duty, a journey to Canterbury or Compostela or Rome undertaken for the salvation of one's soul. In practice, it is also an excuse to travel, to escape the confines of village life, to engage in behaviors that would be scandalous at home but are somehow permissible when one is on pilgrimage. These men have the elaborate staffs and scallop-shell badges of Canterbury pilgrims, but their manner suggests devotion to gods older and darker than Christ. They gamble with intensity, hunched over the table, the dice carved from bone clicking against the wood, fortunes won and lost with each throw. And in the shadows near the door, barely visible in the smoke and gloom, figures move with calculated purpose. Thieves assessing the room, marking the merchants who carry purses, the drunk who will not notice fingers dipping into their pockets. Prostitutes negotiating with potential clients, their transactions conducted in whispers and gestures, their work neither legal nor fully illegal but existing in the gray zone of tolerated vice. The tavern contains multitudes. The desperate and the predatory. The devout and the damned. The seekers of community and the dealers of violence. And all of this seething, dangerous, vital humanity, revolves around ale. The alewife who poured your drink is not merely a barmaid in the modern sense. She is a brewer, an entrepreneur, a linchpin of the local economy, and a woman operating in one of the few trades where female independence is not only tolerated but expected. In medieval England, brewing is women's work. Not because men are incapable, but because brewing is an extension of domestic labor, connected to the preparation of food, and therefore falls within the feminine sphere. The alewife brews in her own home, in the back room or the cellar, using equipment that is often indistinguishable from cooking implements. A large vat for mashing grain, a wooden paddle for stirring, barrels for fermentation and storage. The process is both art and science, though the science is understood only through experience, not theory. Barley or wheat is malted, soaked in water, allowed to germinate, then dried in a kiln to arrest the germination. The malted grain is ground and mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid called wort. The wort is boiled, originally with herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow, though by the 14th century, hops from the continent are beginning to replace traditional bittering agents. The boiled wort is cooled and transferred to barrels, where yeast, though medieval brewers do not call it that, do not understand it as a living organism, is added to begin fermentation. This is alchemy. Water and grain transformed into something nourishing, mildly intoxicating, and safe to drink. The alewife who can brew good ale, who can produce a consistent product that does not sour within days, who can judge the right balance of ingredients and fermentation time, is valuable. She is providing a service more essential than the blacksmith's horseshoes or the carpenter's furniture. She is keeping people alive. But the work is hard and the margins are thin. Grain is expensive, especially after a poor harvest. Fuel for boiling the wort costs money. Barrels wear out and must be replaced. And the license to sell ale, what a license is even required, costs silver the alewife may not have. Many operate illegally, brewing and selling without permission, hoping the local ale taster, a minor official charged with enforcing quality standards and collecting fees, will not notice or can be bribed to look the other way. The alewife must also manage the human chaos of her establishment. She must know who can be trusted to pay their tab and who will drink and then vanish into the night, debts unpaid. She must know when to serve a drunk one more tankard and when to cut him off, a calculation that balances profit against the risk that he will become violent. She must navigate the complex social dynamics of her patrons, the laborers who resent the soldiers who despise the pilgrims, the merchants who look down on everyone while secretly fearing the thieves. And she must do all of this with no recourse to law enforcement that functions with anything resembling modern efficiency. The city watch, such as it exists, is corrupt, understaffed, and largely ineffective. If violence erupts, she cannot call the police. She must handle it herself, or rely on the other patrons to intervene, which they will do only if it is in their interest. So she is hard. She is watchful. She trusts no one, because trust is a luxury she cannot afford. You nurse your ale, trying to make it last, trying to avoid drawing attention. But attention finds you anyway. A man sits down across from you. Uninvited. Unwelcome. He is perhaps 30, which makes him middle-aged by medieval reckoning, his face scarred and his hands calloused. A soldier, you think, or perhaps a laborer who has seen his share of fights. He grins at you, but there is no warmth in it, only calculation. New to Southwark, friend? You nod cautiously. Friendliness in the medieval tavern is almost always transactional. He wants something. Thought so. You've got the look. Just off the road? He does not wait for an answer. Dangerous, traveling alone? Lot of bad sorts on the roads these days. Robbers. Outlaws. Men who'd cut your throat for the shoes on your feet. He is threatening you. Politely. Conversationally. Establishing dominance. Letting you know that you are vulnerable, that he could harm you if he chose. The question is what he wants in exchange for not harming you. I'm just passing through. You say. No trouble intended. Course not. No trouble at all. He leans back, still smiling. But you know, it's customary, when a traveler comes to a new place, to buy around for the locals. Show you're friendly. Show you're not the law, or a spy, or one of those fucking Flemish wool merchants come to drive down prices. Ah. He wants you to buy him a drink. A small price for being left alone. You signal the alewife, order another round, and watch as the man's grin widens. He accepts the tankard, drains half of it in one long swallow, and then, transaction complete, loses interest in you. He wanders off to join his companions at another table, leaving you alone once more. But the encounter has attracted notice. Now others know you are an outsider, know you have coin, know you can be pressured. You have marked yourself as prey. Around you, the evening deepens. More patrons arrive, crowding the room until there is barely space to move. The smoke thickens. The noise level rises, conversations shouted over the din, laughter that sounds more like aggression, the clatter of tankards on tables, the scrape of benches as people shift position. At the gambling table, the dice game has become heated. Accusations fly. One pilgrim, his face flushed with ale and anger, slams his fist on the table and accuses another of using weighted dice. The accused responds with profanity and insults that question the accuser's parentage, manhood, and salvation. For a moment, it seems it will pass. Just words. Just drunken posturing. But then someone spits. A glob of phlegm lands on the accuser's cheek. And in that instant, words transmute into violence. The accuser lunges across the table, scattering dice and coins, his hands reaching for the throat of the man who spat on him. They crash to the floor, rolling in the filthy rushes, fists flying. The other gamblers jump back, some shouting encouragement, others trying to separate the fighters, still others using the distraction to pocket coins from the table. The alewife appears with a heavy wooden club, bellowing for order. She is ignored. The fighters are beyond hearing, beyond reason, locked in combat that seems almost ritualistic, as if this is the real reason they came to the tavern, not the gambling but the violence that gambling inevitably produces. One of the fighters produces a knife. The blade flashes in the firelight. Someone screams. Blood appears, dark and arterial, soaking into the rushes, adding its iron smell to the miasma of the tavern. Now the alewife wades in, swinging her club, striking indiscriminately, cracking skulls and shoulders and hands. Other patrons join her, not out of justice or morality, but because a killing in the tavern brings the watch, and the watch brings questions, and questions bring trouble for everyone. The fighters are separated, dragged to opposite sides of the room. One is bleeding heavily from a gash on his arm. The other has lost several teeth. Both are still shouting threats, promising vengeance, swearing oaths. But it is over. For now. You realize you are shaking. Your hand grips the tankard so tightly your knuckles are white. This is life in the medieval tavern. Violence is not an aberration. It is a feature. An expectation. In a society where honor is everything, where reputation determines your place in the hierarchy, where insults must be answered with force lest you be marked as weak, the tavern is inevitably a battleground. The game the pilgrims were playing before knives were drawn is called hazard, and it is as close to a universal vice as medieval Europe possesses. Hazard is a dice game, deceptively simple in structure but complex in execution, relying on probability and luck in ways that 14th-century people interpret as the will of God or fate or fortune, the great wheel that spins eternally, raising men up and casting them down with indifference. The basic mechanics are straightforward. One player is the caster, who throws 2 dice and calls a main, a target number between 5 and 9. He then throws again, trying to roll the main without rolling a crabs, a 2, 3, or 12, which results in automatic loss. If he rolls the main, he wins. If he rolls a chance, any other number, that becomes the new target, and he continues throwing until he either rolls the chance again, which wins, or rolls the main, which loses. Simple. Except that around these basic rules accretes an entire subculture of strategy, superstition, and sleight of hand. Experienced players know the odds, understand which mains are most favorable, which chances offer the best probability of success. They blow on the dice for luck, whisper prayers to saints and demons alike, use loaded or shaved dice when they think they can get away with it. Cheating at hazard is an art form. Dice carved from bone are difficult to weight perfectly, but a skilled craftsman can create dice that favor certain numbers by hollowing out one side slightly, or by using bone of varying density. Such dice look normal to the untrained eye but dramatically shift the probabilities in the cheater's favor. Detection requires skill and experience. Honest gamblers watch the dice obsessively, looking for patterns that suggest manipulation. If a player rolls an improbable number of 6s, suspicion grows. If he consistently avoids crabs, accusations follow. And accusations, as we have just witnessed, lead rapidly to violence. But why gamble at all, when the odds are inevitably stacked against the average player, when the house or the professional gambler or the clever cheat will eventually take your money? Because gambling is not merely about winning. It is about control, or the illusion of control. In a world where plague can kill you tomorrow, where famine is one failed harvest away, where violence is random and justice is arbitrary, gambling offers the seductive lie that skill and luck can be manipulated, that fate can be bent to your will through the correct invocation or the right throw of the dice. Gambling is also social. It creates bonds between players, a community of shared risk. The men who gamble together night after night develop relationships, alliances, enmities that structure their social world. The tavern gambling table is where reputations are made and destroyed, where stories are born that will be retold for years. And gambling is transgressive. The church condemns it, preaches against it in sermons, threatens gamblers with hellfire and damnation. But the church condemns many things, and its prohibitions often serve more to define sin than to prevent it. To gamble is to assert independence from clerical authority, to claim a space of autonomy where the individual, not the priest, determines his actions. As the gambling resumes, the bloodied fighters having been thrown out into the street, the coins redistributed, new players eager to test their luck, you notice another layer of activity in the tavern's shadowed corners. Prostitution. It is omnipresent in medieval cities, particularly in districts like Southwark where ecclesiastical authorities turn a studied blind eye. The prostitutes who work the taverns are not the courtesans of Italian city-states, not the educated companions who could discuss poetry and philosophy. They are desperate women, often widows or abandoned wives, sometimes runaways from abusive households, occasionally girls sold by their own families. They are at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below even the laborers and beggars, and their work is dangerous in ways that go far beyond the physical. Disease is rampant. Syphilis will not arrive in Europe for another century, but gonorrhea, chlamydia, and a host of other sexually transmitted infections are endemic. Without effective treatment, these diseases cause chronic pain, infertility, and often death. The prostitute who contracts an infection has no recourse to medicine that works, only prayer, folk remedies, and the faint hope that her body's immune system will fight off the infection before it kills her. Violence is constant. Clients who refuse to pay. Clients who become violent during the act. Clients who view the prostitute as subhuman and therefore deserving of whatever abuse they wish to inflict. The prostitute cannot appeal to the law. Her profession, while tolerated, is not protected. If she is beaten or raped or murdered, the authorities shrug. She was a whore. What did she expect? And yet prostitution persists because it must. Because there is a market, an endless demand from soldiers and laborers and traveling merchants, from married men seeking variety, from young men who cannot afford a wife, from the lonely and the violent and the desperate. And because some women, faced with the choice between starvation and prostitution, between watching their children starve and selling their bodies, choose survival. The transactions happen in corners, in whispered negotiations. A price is agreed upon, usually a few pennies, perhaps the cost of a meal. The couple disappears, sometimes to a back room if the alewife permits it, more often to an alley or a nearby stable or simply against the wall outside, transaction completed. In darkness and haste, pleasure extracted from desperation. You watch this from the corner of your eye, trying not to stare, not to judge, aware that judgment is a luxury of those who have never been hungry enough, desperate enough, hopeless enough to do whatever survival requires. The tavern's cast of characters expands as the night deepens. You begin to recognize types, archetypes that recur across all taverns in all cities. The veteran, older soldier, scarred and limping, nursing a single tankard through the evening because that is all he can afford, staring into the fire and remembering battles that no one else cares about. The braggart, loud young man, probably a merchant's son, buying rounds to impress companions, telling exaggerated stories of commercial success or sexual conquest, voice growing louder with each drink until he provokes someone into shutting him up. The silent drinker, man at the end of the table who speaks to no one, drinks methodically, his purpose not socialization but obliteration, seeking to drown something, grief, guilt, memory, in ale. The thief, moving through the crowd with casual confidence, fingers quick and practiced, lifting purses with such skill that victims do not realize they have been robbed until hours later. The priest, ostensibly slumming, researching vice for a sermon, but his eyes linger too long on the prostitutes, his hand trembles slightly as he lifts his wine, and everyone knows he is here for the same reasons as everyone else, only with more hypocrisy. These are not individuals. They are types, roles in a recurring drama that plays out every night in every tavern across Christendom. The script varies in details but the themes remain constant: drink, gambling, sex, violence, the endless human effort to find connection or escape or simply to survive until morning. As the night wears on, the tavern's social dynamics become increasingly fluid and dangerous. Alliances form and dissolve. Conversations grow louder, arguments more heated. The line between camaraderie and conflict becomes vanishingly thin. This is the nature of alcohol, of course. It lowers inhibitions, amplifies emotions, transforms minor slights into deadly insults. But in the medieval world, where violence is not merely a possibility but a constant undercurrent of daily life, alcohol's disinhibiting effects are particularly dangerous. Consider the weapons. Every man in the tavern, and many of the women, carries a knife. Not a dinner knife, not a tool, but a weapon, a blade 6 or 8 inches long, sharp enough to kill with a single thrust to the belly or throat. These knives are tools of necessity in a world where pre-cut food does not exist, where everyone is expected to carve their own meat, but they are also weapons of last resort, the medieval equivalent of a concealed carry handgun. Some patrons also carry cudgels or clubs, heavy pieces of wood that can crack skulls. Soldiers have swords, though drawing a sword in a tavern is considered extreme escalation, an announcement of lethal intent. But swords do get drawn, especially when honor is at stake, when an insult cannot be answered with fists alone. The concept of honor in medieval society is difficult for modern people to fully grasp. It is not merely pride or ego, though those are components. Honor is social capital, the currency that determines how others perceive and treat you. A man with honor is respected, feared, given deference. A man without honor is prey, vulnerable to exploitation and violence, his word doubted, his presence tolerated only as long as he remains useful. Honor must be defended constantly. An unanswered insult is not merely embarrassing, it is socially fatal, a public admission of weakness that invites further attacks. Therefore, insults must be answered immediately, with proportionate or escalating force. A verbal insult demands a verbal response. A push demands a push back. A spilled drink, and drinks are spilled constantly in the crowded, jostling space of the tavern, can become the spark that ignites a brawl. Or a duel. This hair-trigger's sensitivity to insult, combined with alcohol and weapons, makes the medieval tavern one of the most dangerous spaces in an already dangerous world. Contemporary court records from English cities are filled with inquests into tavern deaths. Men stabbed over card games, throats cut during arguments about debts, heads smashed in fights that began as drunken shoving matches. The authorities respond to this violence with a combination of resignation and occasional brutal enforcement. Murder is technically illegal, but proving murder requires witnesses willing to testify, and tavern patrons have a strong cultural aversion to cooperating with law enforcement. The code is clear: you handle your own problems, or you don't handle them at all. Involving the watch makes you a snitch, a violation of community norms worse than the original violence. When the watch does intervene, punishments are savage. Murderers, if caught and convicted, are hanged. Lesser offenders might be placed in the stocks for public humiliation, pelted with rotten vegetables and human waste by passers-by. Thieves lose hands. Repeat offenders lose lives. But conviction rates are low. The medieval justice system is neither blind nor impartial. Wealthy defendants can afford lawyers who understand the intricacies of law and procedure. They can produce character witnesses, pay fines in lieu of physical punishment, petition the king for pardons. Poor defendants have none of these options. If they are accused, they are likely guilty. If they are guilty, they hang. So the tavern exists in a gray zone of semi-lawlessness, a space where violence is common but rarely prosecuted, where the strong prey on the weak and survival depends on a combination of strength, cunning, and luck. You have been in the tavern for perhaps 3 hours now, though time is difficult to judge in the smoke and noise and chaos. Your initial tankard of ale has been replaced by a second, purchased reluctantly because leaving too soon marks you as suspicious or fearful. The alcohol is beginning to affect you, not drunkenness, but a loosening, a slight dulling of the sharp edges of anxiety. At the next table, a group of craftsmen, carpenters, judging by the wood shavings on their clothes, are singing. Not the bardic ballads of fantasy, but bawdy songs, verses of shocking obscenity describing sexual acts in anatomical detail, punctuated by roaring laughter. This is the entertainment of the medieval tavern: communal singing, usually filthy, always loud, serving to bond the singers and mark them as a group distinct from the silent drinkers and the gamblers and the fighters. The songs are crude but also revealing. They speak to a culture where sex is discussed openly, without the Victorian prudishness that would later emerge, but also without romance or sentiment. Sex in these songs is mechanical, transactional, often violent. Women are objects to be conquered, bragged about, discarded. There is no tenderness, no mutual pleasure, only domination. This reflects the broader gender dynamics of medieval society, where women exist in a state of perpetual legal and social subordination. They cannot own property independently of fathers or husbands. They cannot testify in court on equal terms with men. They are valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and their sexual purity, until that purity is lost, at which point they become essentially worthless, fit only for manual labor or prostitution. The alewife is an exception to these rules, a woman who operates with relative independence because her trade is necessary and because widowhood has freed her from male control. But her independence is precarious, dependent on her ability to maintain order in her establishment, to produce good ale, to navigate the complex web of obligations and debts that structure the local economy. She moves through the tavern now, collecting empty tankards, calculating tabs, making mental notes of who has paid and who is drinking on credit that will need to be collected later. She does not smile. She does not chat. She is working, and work in the medieval world is brutal, unending, a struggle against poverty and hunger that never truly stops. The fire in the hearth is beginning to die down, embers glowing red beneath a layer of ash. No one tends it properly, fuel is expensive, and the alewife hoards her wood and peat carefully, burning only enough to take the edge off the cold. The temperature in the tavern drops. Patrons huddle closer together, seeking warmth in proximity, their breath visible in the smoky air. Outside, the city is dark. There are no street lights, no gas lamps, no electric glow. London after dark is a maze of alleys and streets where even the locals can become lost, where robbers and cutthroats wait for the drunk and unwary. The curfew bell has long since rung, theoretically requiring all citizens to be indoors, but the curfew is ignored by those who have nowhere to go or who are too drunk to care about the consequences of being caught. You realize you will need to find somewhere to sleep. The alehouse does not offer rooms. This is not an inn. Your options are limited. Find a stable and pay a few pennies to sleep in the straw among the horses, or find a corner of a church porch and hope you are not robbed or murdered before dawn. Both options are grim. But they are the reality of medieval urban life for the majority of people, who possess neither wealth nor social connections sufficient to ensure basic safety and shelter. The tavern is beginning to empty slightly as some patrons depart, staggering into the night. But others arrive, night shift workers finishing their labor, criminals emerging from hiding, the truly desperate seeking one last drink before facing whatever awaits them in the darkness. The cycle continues. The tavern never truly closes, never fully empties. It is a liminal space, a threshold between day and night, order and chaos, life and death. One of the newcomers is a figure who commands immediate attention, a cloaked man who moves with deliberate care, his face hidden within the shadow of his hood. He does not approach the bar immediately. Instead, he scans the room, assessing, calculating. When he finally speaks to the alewife, his voice is low, inaudible over the din, but she nods and gestures toward a back room. This is a fence. A buyer and seller of stolen goods, a middleman in the thriving underground economy that exists parallel to legitimate commerce. In a world where most property lacks serial numbers or unique identifying marks, where a stolen silver candlestick looks identical to a legitimately purchased one, fencing is a lucrative and relatively safe profession. The fence deals primarily with thieves, purchasing their loot at a fraction of its market value and then reselling it to customers who ask no uncomfortable questions about provenance. A stolen chalice from a church becomes a wealthy merchant's table decoration. A noblewoman's jewelry, lifted by a skilled pickpocket during a crowded market, reappears on the finger of another noblewoman who believes she got a bargain. The fence's presence in the tavern is not accidental. Taverns serve as hubs for criminal enterprise, neutral ground where thieves and fences and corrupt officials can meet without attracting suspicion. The alewife tolerates this because she has no choice. Refusing to allow the fence to operate would mark her as uncooperative, potentially dangerous, and criminals do not respond well to lack of cooperation. Moreover, the fence pays well for the privilege. He buys rounds for the house, tips generously, and ensures that anyone who might inform on him knows that doing so would have consequences far worse than anything the law could inflict. You watch from the corner of your eye as thieves approach the back room, one by one, carrying small bundles or bulging purses. They disappear inside for a few minutes, then emerge lighter, a faint jingle of coin audible as they return to the main room to spend their newfound wealth on ale and gambling and prostitutes. This is the ecosystem of the medieval underworld, as structured and hierarchical as the legitimate economy, with its own rules and customs and enforcement mechanisms. At the bottom are the pickpockets and burglars, taking physical risks for small rewards. Above them are the fences, who take fewer risks and claim larger shares of the profit. Above the fences are the corrupt officials, the watchmen who can be bribed to look the other way, the magistrates who dismiss charges against the right defendant, the guild masters who run protection rackets disguised as trade organizations. And at the very top are the criminal lords, men who control entire neighborhoods, who command networks of thieves and enforcers, who live in townhouses and dress like merchants but whose wealth derives from vice and violence. These men are known to everyone but prosecuted by no one, because they are too powerful, too well connected, too willing to use lethal force against anyone who threatens them. The tavern is where these layers intersect, where the pickpocket and the criminal lord might drink at adjacent tables, separated by status but united by the understanding that they all exist outside the law, that they are all playing a dangerous game where capture means the gallows. You finish your second tankard of ale and immediately feel the pressure in your bladder. This presents a problem. There is no toilet in the medieval tavern. No bathroom, no latrine, no facility of any kind designed for sanitation. The options are to step outside into the alley and relieve yourself against the wall, or to use the tavern's communal piss pot, a large ceramic vessel kept in the corner, emptied only when it overflows, contributing its pungent aroma to the tavern's olfactory symphony. You choose the alley. Standing, you push through the crowd toward the door, carefully avoiding eye contact, trying not to jostle anyone's drink or step on anyone's foot, both of which could be interpreted as insults requiring violent response. The night air hits you like a fist. Cold. Sharp. After the stifling atmosphere of the tavern, it is almost painful to breathe. Your eyes adjust slowly to the darkness. There is no moon tonight, or if there is, the clouds obscure it. The alley is invisible, a void punctuated only by the faint glow leaking from the tavern's door, and the occasional spark from a dying torch mounted on a distant wall. You relieve yourself against the tavern's exterior wall, adding your contribution to the centuries of accumulated urine that stains the timber. The smell is overpowering, but you are too drunk to care much. A sound behind you. Footsteps. You turn, suddenly alert, hand moving instinctively to your belt where your knife should be, but you realize with cold dread that you left it on the table inside, attached to your eating utensils, an unforgivable lapse in a world where being unarmed is tantamount to suicide. Two figures emerge from the darkness. Men, though their features are indistinct in the gloom. They do not speak. They simply advance, one circling to your left, the other to your right, boxing you in. Robbers. Or murderers. The distinction is academic. Your mind races. Options: run? You are drunk and disoriented, and they know the streets better than you do. Fight? Unarmed against two opponents? Scream for help? In Southwark, screams are ignored. People mind their own business. You prepare to run, tensing your muscles, calculating the angle that might let you slip past them. But before you can move, the tavern door bursts open, spilling light and noise into the alley. The alewife stands silhouetted in the doorway, her club in hand. "Not in front of my fucking door, you cunts!" The would-be robbers freeze. One makes a gesture that might be conciliatory, might be obscene. They retreat, fading back into the darkness, their footsteps receding. Not because they fear you, but because they fear her, or more accurately, they fear the consequences of crossing someone who operates a successful tavern in Southwark. The alewife has connections. She knows people. Cross her, and you might find yourself floating face down in the Thames. You stagger back inside, heart hammering, hands shaking. The alewife says nothing, simply nods once, acknowledgement, not sympathy, and returns to her work. Lesson learned: the medieval night is lethal. Stay inside. Stay alert. Stay armed. You reclaim your seat at the table, checking to ensure your knife is still there. It is. You strap it more securely to your belt, vowing not to make the same mistake twice. The near miss has sobered you slightly. You look around the tavern with new eyes, seeing not the romance of communal drinking but the reality. This is a gathering of predators and prey, a space where violence simmers beneath every interaction, where survival depends on constant vigilance and a willingness to inflict harm before harm is inflicted upon you. The hours grind onward. Midnight passes, not that anyone marks it, as mechanical clocks are rare and most people judge time by the church bells that ring canonical hours. The tavern's population continues to shift, some depart, others arrive, the composition constantly changing but the atmosphere remaining constant. At the gambling table, a new game has begun. Not hazard this time, but cards. Playing cards are a relatively recent innovation in 14th century Europe, imported from the Islamic world via Spain and Italy, still exotic enough to carry an aura of foreign decadence. The deck being used is homemade, the cards crudely drawn on stiff parchment, the suits bearing only passing resemblance to the standardized designs that will emerge in later centuries. The game itself is unclear to you. Medieval card games rarely have consistent rules, varying from region to region, sometimes from table to table. But the dynamic is familiar, men hunched over their hands, studying the cards with furrowed brows, making bets, accusing each other of cheating, the tension rising with each hand. Card playing, like dice, occupies an ambiguous moral space. The Church condemns it as gambling, a vice that leads men away from God and towards spiritual ruin. But the Church's prohibition is selective and inconsistent. Bishops play cards. Monks play cards. Even some priests, in the privacy of their rectories, indulge. The prohibition exists more as an ideal than as a practical restriction, observed when convenient, ignored when not. For the laborer or soldier spending his wages at the tavern gaming table, the Church's disapproval is irrelevant. He does not expect to die in a state of grace. He does not imagine himself ascending to heaven on wings of piety. His ambitions are more modest: to win enough coin to buy another round, to have something to boast about tomorrow, to experience the brief thrill of victory in a life otherwise characterized by grinding labor and slow decline. The cards slap against the table. Coins clink. A winner crows, a loser curses. The wheel of fortune spins, raising some and crushing others, indifferent as the cosmos itself. Across the room, one of the prostitutes has attracted a client, a merchant, by his clothing, though his fine wool coat is now stained with mud and ale. They negotiate briefly, her voice too low to hear, his responses accompanied by gestures that grow more animated as he drinks. Finally, terms are agreed. She leads him toward the back room where the fence conducted his business earlier, and they disappear behind a leather curtain that offers the barest illusion of privacy. You do not think about what happens behind that curtain. It is not your concern. In the tavern, survival requires a careful calibration of awareness, knowing enough to avoid danger, but not so much that you become entangled in others' business. The soldiers who were drinking earlier have become increasingly rowdy. Their laughter has taken on an edge, a brittleness that suggests imminent violence. They are telling war stories, recounting battles and sieges, competing to one-up each other with tales of atrocity and endurance. One describes the siege of Caen, where English soldiers butchered the garrison and much of the civilian population. Another counters with a story from the chevauchée through Normandy, where villages were burned and livestock slaughtered and women raped as deliberate acts of economic warfare, designed to destroy France's capacity to support its own armies. These are not cautionary tales. They are not confessions seeking absolution. They are boasts, bragging rights, proof of masculinity and martial prowess. The soldier who has killed the most, who has inflicted the most suffering, commands the most respect from his peers. To modern ears, this is monstrous. But in the medieval military culture, where warfare is total and civilian casualties are not collateral damage but deliberate strategy, where the line between soldier and brigand is vanishingly thin, such stories are normal. Expected. The currency of reputation. The Church attempts to impose limits through the concept of just war and the prohibition against harming non-combatants, but these restrictions are observed primarily in the breach. Soldiers know the theology. They know they are sinning. They simply do not care, or they have convinced themselves that the enemy, French, in this case, are deserving of whatever horrors are inflicted upon them. One of the soldiers notices you listening. His eyes narrow. You got a problem, friend? The tone is not friendly. It is a challenge, an invitation to conflict. You must respond carefully. Too much deference marks you as weak, inviting further aggression. Too little invites immediate violence. No problem, you say. Just listening to good stories. He studies you for a moment, trying to determine if you are mocking him. Finally, he grunts and turns back to his companions, accepting your response as adequate. You exhale slowly, aware of how close you came to a beating or worse. The alewife appears at your elbow, startling you. You need to leave, she says quietly. Those soldiers are looking for a fight, and you're marked as an outsider. If they decide you're the target, I can't protect you. It is good advice. The wise course is to thank her and depart, find somewhere, anywhere, else to spend the remaining hours until dawn. But leaving means stepping into the darkness, navigating streets where robbers wait for the unwary, where your chances of reaching shelter alive are perhaps 50-50. Is there anywhere I can stay? You ask. Even a corner where I can sleep? She considers, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nods toward a staircase in the far corner, barely visible in the smoke. There's a loft above. Used to store grain, but it's mostly empty now. 2 pennies, and you can sleep there. No guarantees about the rats. 2 pennies. Expensive, but less expensive than being robbed or killed. You produce the coins. She pockets them and gestures for you to follow. The staircase is narrow and steep, the steps worn smooth by centuries of use. At the top is a low-ceilinged space under the eaves, barely tall enough to stand upright, thick with dust and the smell of old grain. The floor is bare wood, cold and hard. But it is shelter, and in the medieval world, shelter is victory. You lie down, wrapping your cloak around yourself for warmth. Below, the sounds of the tavern continue, laughter, arguments, the clatter of tankards, the occasional crash of something breaking. The sounds blend into a kind of white noise, the soundtrack of medieval urban life. Sleep comes slowly, interrupted by the scurrying of rats in the rafters and the cold that seeps through the floorboards. But eventually, exhaustion overwhelms discomfort, and you drift into uneasy unconsciousness. Dawn arrives not with sunrise but with the crowing of roosters and the gradual increase in noise from the street below. You wake stiff and cold, your body aching from the hard floor, your mouth sour with the residue of last night's ale. Descending the stairs, you find the tavern transformed. The crowd has thinned dramatically. A few die-hard drinkers remain, slumped over tables, unconscious or nearly so. The alewife is sweeping the floor, or attempting to. The rushes resist her efforts, clumped and matted with the accumulated filth of the previous night. The fire has burned down to ash. Weak gray light filters through the shutters, doing little to improve the tavern's appearance. If anything, daylight makes it worse, revealing stains and damage that were mercifully hidden in the darkness. Bodies lie in the corners. Not corpses, at least you hope not corpses, but men too drunk to make it home, sleeping off their excess where they fell. No one disturbs them. The alewife steps over them as she works, occasionally prodding one with her foot to ensure he is still breathing. The gambler who was stabbed last night is gone, either dead and removed or alive and departed. There is no sign of the fight, no blood on the floor, or rather, any blood is indistinguishable from the other stains that mottle the rushes. You approach the bar. The alewife looks up, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who has been awake all night, who will continue working all day, who knows no rest except the brief oblivion of sleep before the cycle begins again. "Breakfast?" she asks, without enthusiasm. You nod. She ladles pottage from the cauldron into a wooden bowl. The stew has thickened overnight, congealing into a paste that is more solid than liquid. You spoon it up, chewing bits of unidentifiable vegetable and gristle, washing it down with weak ale that tastes even worse in daylight than it did the previous evening. But it is food. It is sustenance. It will keep you alive for another day. As you eat, a realization settles over you: this is not exceptional. This is not a particularly bad tavern or an unusually violent night. This is normal. This is what life in medieval Europe looks like for the majority of people, not the knights and nobles and clergy who populate the historical chronicles, but the laborers and craftsmen and soldiers and prostitutes and thieves who form the bulk of the population. They live in filth because there is no alternative. They drink because water is deadly. They gamble because life is uncertain and gambling offers the illusion of control. They resort to violence because honor demands it, and because law enforcement is absent or corrupt or both. They patronize prostitutes because sex is one of the few pleasures available in lives otherwise characterized by brutality and deprivation. And they gather in taverns because taverns are the only communal spaces that welcome them, the only places where social distinctions temporarily blur, where a laborer and a merchant might sit at the same table, where community, however fragile, however temporary, can be built. The medieval tavern is a paradox. It is a place of vice and exploitation, where the desperate prey on the more desperate, where violence and disease and moral corruption flourish. But it is also a place of community and connection, where people gather to escape isolation, to find companionship, to experience moments of joy and solidarity in a world that offers precious few of either. This duality is not accidental. It reflects the nature of medieval society itself, brutal and beautiful, cruel and communal, a world where life is cheap but human connection is priceless. The tavern is the beating heart of this world. It is where news is exchanged, where deals are struck, where marriages are arranged and feuds are born. It is where the laborer drinks away his wages and the thief spends his loot, and the soldier tries to forget the horrors he has witnessed and inflicted. It is where the prostitute finds clients, and the alewife makes her living and the gambler chases fortune's wheel. It is, in short, the most honest representation of medieval life that exists, unromanticized, unfiltered, raw. Modern people, looking back across the centuries, tend to sentimentalize the medieval period. We focus on the knights and castles, the Gothic cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts, the tales of chivalry and courtly love. We construct a fantasy Middle Ages that is aesthetically pleasing but historically false. The tavern destroys that fantasy. It forces us to confront the reality that medieval Europe was a place of grinding poverty, casual violence, and pervasive disease. That most people lived short, hard lives with little hope of improvement. That entertainment and pleasure were found not in grand tournaments or literary salons but in drinking cheap ale and gambling with loaded dice and hiring prostitutes in filthy back rooms. This is not to say that the Middle Ages were uniquely terrible. Every historical period has its horrors and its beauties. But the medieval tavern, in its brutal honesty, reminds us that history is not a story of steady progress from darkness to light, that our ancestors were not simpler or purer or more virtuous than we are, and that many of the vices and virtues we consider modern have existed in various forms for as long as humans have gathered together. The tavern also reveals the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the filth and danger and deprivation, people continued to gather, to build communities, to seek connection. The medieval peasant drinking away his sorrows was not fundamentally different from the modern office worker drowning his stress in a bar after work. The soldier seeking oblivion in alcohol was responding to trauma in the same way soldiers have responded for millennia. The gambler chasing losses was exhibiting the same psychological patterns documented in modern casinos. We are, in other words, not so different from our medieval ancestors. We have better sanitation and medicine and law enforcement, but the fundamental human needs, for community, for escape, for connection, for meaning, remain unchanged. As the morning progresses, the tavern begins to fill again. Not with the same patrons who were there last night. Most of them are sleeping off their excesses or have moved on to their daily labor, but with a new crop of customers seeking breakfast, seeking company, seeking ale to steady their hands and quiet their anxieties before facing the day. The cycle continues. The tavern never fully closes. It exists in a state of perpetual operation, a constant churn of patrons and transactions, a machine that converts grain into ale and ale into coin and coin into the alewife's survival. You finish your pottage and ale. You gather your few possessions, a traveling pack, your knife, the small pouch of coins that represents your entire worldly wealth. You nod to the alewife, who acknowledges you with a grunt, and you step out into the street. London greets you with its characteristic assault on the senses. The streets are already crowded with people, craftsmen heading to workshops, vendors setting up market stalls, beggars taking their positions at church doors. The smell of the city is overwhelming: human waste, animal dung, rotting garbage, all of it mixing with the smoke from thousands of cooking fires to create a miasma that clings to everything. You navigate the streets carefully, avoiding the deepest mud, giving wide berth to the pigs that roam freely eating garbage, keeping alert for pickpockets and other threats. Medieval London is not a safe place. Violence is common. Disease is rampant. A simple injury, a cut that becomes infected, a broken bone that heals poorly, can mean death. But you survived the night in the tavern. You emerged alive, unrobbed, unmurdered. In the medieval world, this counts as success. As you walk, you reflect on what you witnessed. The tavern was a microcosm of medieval society, containing in one smoky, filthy room all the elements that define the age: desperation and community, violence and connection, vice and survival. The alewife, brewing and selling ale to keep herself and perhaps a family alive, operating in one of the few trades where women could achieve a measure of independence. The soldiers, traumatized by war, seeking oblivion in drink and finding only temporary escape. The prostitutes, selling their bodies to survive, existing at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. The thieves and fences, building an alternative economy in the shadows of the legitimate one. The gamblers, chasing luck and fortune, trying to impose order on chaos through the throw of dice. All of them were products of their environment, shaped by forces they did not control and could barely comprehend. The medieval economic system, feudalism in the countryside, guild capitalism in the cities, created winners and losers, concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite, while consigning the vast majority to poverty. The medieval church, for all its rhetoric about charity and compassion, functioned primarily to maintain the existing social order, teaching the poor to accept their lot as God's will and to seek reward in the afterlife rather than improvement in the present. The tavern was where these contradictions became visible. It was a place of liberation, from labor, from social convention, from the omnipresent eye of authority, but also a place of exploitation, where the poor were separated from their meager earnings, where the vulnerable were preyed upon, where violence was normalized. And yet people kept coming back. Night after night, year after year, century after century. Because despite everything, the tavern fulfilled needs that could not be met elsewhere. It was a third place, neither home nor work, where social bonds could form across class lines, where news and gossip circulated, where deals were made and relationships forged. The legacy of the medieval tavern extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The modern pub, the bar, the cafe, all are descendants of the alehouse and tavern, serving similar functions of socialization and community formation. The specific vices may have changed. We no longer worry about deadly drinking water, and prostitution is more heavily criminalized in most modern societies. But the fundamental pattern remains: humans gather to drink, to talk, to escape, to connect. Even the violence persists, though in more attenuated form. Bar fights are common enough that they have become clichés. Gambling remains popular, now conducted in casinos and online platforms rather than over dice and cards in smoke-filled rooms. The dynamics of honor and insult, though less likely to result in immediate bloodshed, still structure social interactions in bars and clubs around the world. The medieval tavern, in other words, is not ancient history. It is the ancestor of modern social spaces, the prototype from which all others descend. Understanding the medieval tavern requires us to abandon our romantic preconceptions, to set aside the fantasy of cozy firelight and bardic songs, and to confront the harsh reality of what life was actually like for our ancestors. It was brutal. It was filthy. It was dangerous. People died from causes we would consider trivial: infections, malnutrition, violence over petty slights. But it was also deeply human. People loved and laughed, and formed friendships and communities despite the hardships. They found moments of joy in the midst of suffering. They persevered, generation after generation, surviving plague and famine and war, building lives and families and futures against all odds. The tavern was where this humanity was most visible. Stripped of pretense, unmasked by alcohol, people revealed their true selves, sometimes ugly, sometimes noble, usually some mixture of both. The laborer who spent his wages on ale might seem irresponsible by modern standards, but he was also seeking relief from labor so physically demanding that most modern people could not endure it for a single day. The prostitute selling her body was participating in exploitation, but she was also exercising agency in a world that offered women almost no legitimate paths to independence. Moral judgment of medieval people must be tempered by understanding of their context. They lived in a world fundamentally different from ours, where options were limited, where survival itself required constant struggle, where the social safety nets we take for granted did not exist. The tavern was a response to that world, a space of temporary escape, of community formation, of survival. It was imperfect, dangerous, often destructive. But it was also necessary, and in its necessity, there is a kind of tragic nobility. The historical sources that allow us to reconstruct the medieval tavern are fragmentary and often biased. Court records provide accounts of violence and crime but rarely describe ordinary nights where nothing dramatic occurred. Church sermons condemn taverns as dens of sin but offer little detail about what actually happened inside them. Literary sources, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the fabliaux of medieval France, provide colorful descriptions but are filtered through narrative conventions and authorial agendas. Archaeologists excavating medieval sites have found the physical remains of taverns, the foundations of buildings, the shards of broken pottery, the bones of animals consumed as food. These artifacts tell us something about material culture, what people ate, what vessels they drank from, how buildings were constructed, but they cannot reveal the human stories, the lived experiences of patrons and Alewives. We must therefore reconstruct the medieval tavern through a combination of historical imagination and evidence-based inference, drawing on multiple sources to build a picture that is plausible if not provable. The tavern described in this narrative is a composite, drawing on details from different times and places across 14th and 15th century Europe, synthesized into a coherent whole. But the fundamental patterns are solid. Medieval people did drink ale as their primary beverage because water was unsafe. Taverns did serve as social hubs where people gathered across class lines. Violence was common, driven by honor culture and alcohol, and the ready availability of weapons. Prostitution was widespread and largely tolerated. Gambling was ubiquitous despite church prohibition. The conditions were filthy by modern standards, characterized by poor sanitation and no understanding of germ theory. These are not speculative claims. They are documented in hundreds of contemporary sources from across medieval Europe. What emerges from these sources is a picture of the tavern as a complex, multifaceted institution that defies simple categorization. It was simultaneously an economic institution, where money changed hands, where prices were negotiated, where informal credit networks operated. A social institution, where communities formed, where news spread, where reputations were made and destroyed. A political institution, where opposition to authority could be voiced, where resistance could be organized, where the power of the elite could be challenged if only temporarily. A religious institution, paradoxically, despite church condemnation, where prayers were said, where saints were invoked, where the boundary between sacred and profane blurred. A criminal institution, where stolen goods were fenced, where conspiracies were hatched, where violence was planned and executed. The medieval authorities understood all of this, which is why taverns were simultaneously tolerated and regulated, taxed and monitored, condemned and protected. A city without taverns would have been unthinkable. Where would people gather? Where would travelers find lodging? Where would the daily drink that kept people alive be obtained? But a city where taverns operated without oversight was dangerous, a potential breeding ground for crime and rebellion. The result was a system of licensing and regulation that varied widely across medieval Europe but followed similar patterns. Alewives and tavern keepers were required to register with local authorities, to pay fees, to submit their ale to testing by official ale tasters who verified quality and correct measure. Those who brewed and sold without license faced fines, confiscation of their ale, and in extreme cases, physical punishment. But enforcement was inconsistent at best. Local officials were often corrupt, willing to overlook violations in exchange for bribes. The sheer number of unlicensed alehouses made comprehensive enforcement impossible. And the authorities themselves recognized that overly strict regulation would simply drive the trade underground, making it even harder to monitor. The medieval tavern thus existed in a gray zone of semi-legality, tolerated more than approved, regulated more in theory than in practice. This gray zone was where much of medieval urban life occurred, in the spaces between official law and actual practice, where people navigated through a combination of custom, negotiation, and occasional violence. Modern people, accustomed to clearly defined legal frameworks and consistent enforcement, often struggle to understand medieval legal culture. We expect laws to be enforced uniformly, expect that similar crimes will receive similar punishments, expect that legal processes will follow established procedures. The medieval reality was far messier. Law was local, varying from town to town, from manor to manor. Enforcement depended on the personalities and priorities of individual officials. Punishment was often arbitrary, determined more by the status of the accused than by the nature of the crime. Justice was not blind, it was acutely aware of social hierarchy, of patron-client relationships, of who had power and who did not. The tavern reflected this legal chaos. It was a space where law was present but attenuated, where violent crimes went unpunished if the perpetrator had the right connections, where property crimes were prosecuted selectively based on the wealth of the victim, where morality laws were enforced against the powerless and ignored for the powerful. This does not mean medieval people were immoral, or that medieval society was anarchic. Rather, it means that order was maintained through different mechanisms than those we rely on today. Social pressure, reputation, and the threat of communal exclusion were often more powerful than legal punishment. The thief who was known to be a thief might escape legal prosecution but would find it difficult to do business, difficult to find lodging, difficult to survive in a world where community ties were essential. The tavern was where these informal enforcement mechanisms operated most visibly. A man who cheated at gambling would be called out, his reputation destroyed, his presence at future games unwelcome. A woman who stole from the alewife would be banned from the establishment, a serious penalty in a world with limited options for socialization. A soldier who became too violent, too unpredictable, would find himself drinking alone, shunned by others who valued their own safety. These informal sanctions were not always fair, not always consistent, but they were effective in maintaining a baseline of order sufficient to allow the tavern to function. Without them, the tavern would have collapsed into total chaos, becoming unusable for anyone seeking genuine community rather than simply violence and exploitation. The remarkable thing is that despite all the dangers and unpleasantness, the tavern survived and thrived for centuries. It met needs that no other institution could satisfy, provided services that were essential to medieval urban life, created spaces where humanity could flourish in however limited a fashion. The evolution of the tavern from the medieval period through the Renaissance and into the modern era reveals both continuity and change. The basic function, providing drink and social space, remained constant, but the specific forms adapted to changing economic, social, and technological conditions. The introduction of coffee and tea in the 17th century created new kinds of social spaces, coffee houses, that competed with taverns while also complementing them. Coffee houses appealed to a different clientele, merchants and intellectuals who wanted stimulation rather than intoxication, who valued conversation and the exchange of ideas over gambling and violence. The coffee house became associated with Enlightenment culture, with rationality and progress, in explicit contrast to the tavern's association with traditional culture, superstition, and vice. But taverns did not disappear. They evolved, adapting to new contexts. The English pub emerged as a somewhat more respectable version of the medieval alehouse, still serving alcohol but with improved sanitation and somewhat reduced violence. The Parisian café blended elements of the coffee house and the tavern, serving both alcohol and coffee, appealing to a broader cross-section of society. In the American colonies and later the United States, taverns played a crucial role in political development. The colonial tavern was where revolutionaries gathered, where the ideas that would lead to independence were debated and refined. The tavern was a space of relative freedom, where criticism of British rule could be voiced without immediate repercussion, where networks of resistance could be built and maintained. This political function of the tavern echoes its medieval role as a space outside normal hierarchies, where authority could be questioned if not openly challenged. The American revolutionaries understood this, which is why so much revolutionary organizing happened in taverns, why the committees of correspondence met in taverns, why the Boston Tea Party was planned in a tavern. The 19th and 20th centuries brought further transformations. Industrialization created new forms of working-class drinking establishments: the gin palace in Victorian England, the beer hall in Germany, the saloon in America, each adapted to the specific conditions of industrial society. These establishments served similar functions to medieval taverns, providing drink, socialization, and escape, but in contexts shaped by factory labor, urbanization, and new forms of class consciousness. The temperance movement and subsequent prohibition efforts in various countries represented attempts to eliminate or severely restrict alcohol consumption, based on the belief that alcohol was the root cause of poverty, crime, and moral degradation. These efforts were partially successful in reducing overall alcohol consumption, but they also demonstrated the resilience of drinking culture. Prohibition in the United States, 1920 to 1933, did not eliminate drinking, it simply drove it underground, creating illegal speakeasies that in some ways resembled medieval alehouses more than legal taverns did, operating without licenses, evading authorities, creating their own informal rules and enforcement mechanisms. The repeal of prohibition and the emergence of modern bars and pubs in the mid-20th century created drinking establishments that are in many ways more sanitized and regulated than their medieval predecessors. Health codes ensure cleaner conditions. Labor laws protect workers. Police enforce laws against violence and theft with greater consistency. Sexual harassment, while still a problem, is at least theoretically prohibited and can result in legal consequences. Yet the fundamental dynamic remains. People still gather in bars to drink, to socialize, to escape from their daily lives. Alcohol still lowers inhibitions and leads to both connection and conflict. Gambling still occurs, though usually in less visible forms. Sex work still intersects with the alcohol industry, though in ways that are more stigmatized and hidden than in medieval Europe. The medieval tavern, then, is not merely historical curiosity. It is the ancestor of institutions that remain central to modern social life. Understanding it requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization, about the persistent patterns of behavior that appear across vastly different historical contexts. We like to think of ourselves as fundamentally different from our medieval ancestors, as more civilized, more rational, more moral. The tavern suggests otherwise. It reveals that the desires and needs that drove medieval people to gather in filthy, dangerous alehouses are fundamentally the same desires and needs that drive modern people to gather in bars and clubs. We have better sanitation and somewhat better behavior, but we are not different in kind, only in degree. This should humble us. It should make us skeptical of narratives of inevitable progress, of stories that portray history as a steady climb from darkness to enlightenment. Progress has occurred in specific domains, medicine, sanitation, legal protections, but human nature remains constant. We are still capable of great cruelty and great kindness, of exploitation and solidarity, of violence and community. The medieval tavern was a mirror held up to medieval society, reflecting both its virtues and its vices. The modern bar serves the same function for modern society. Both reveal the same fundamental truth. Humans are social creatures who need spaces where they can gather, can escape the constraints of daily life, can form connections however temporary or imperfect. The medieval tavern was filthy, dangerous, and morally compromised. But it was also vital, necessary, and deeply human. It was where community was built in a world that offered few other opportunities for cross-class socialization. It was where news spread and deals were made and relationships formed. It was where people survived together, in a world that was trying very hard to kill them individually. We can judge medieval people for their violence, their filth, their exploitation of the vulnerable. But we should also recognize their resilience, their capacity to build community even in the most unpromising circumstances, their determination to find joy and connection despite lives that were, by our standards, almost unbearably hard. The tavern was where all of this happened. The tavern was, in the end, where humanity met in the dark, literally and metaphorically, and where, despite everything, people found ways to connect, to survive, to endure. That is the legacy of the medieval tavern. Not the fantasy of warm fires and jovial songs, but the reality of human beings doing their best to live, to love, to find meaning, in a world that offered them very little comfort and no guarantees. It is a harsh legacy, but an honest one. And honesty, in the end, is what history demands of us, to see the past as it actually was, not as we wish it had been, and to recognize in our ancestors the same flawed, striving, endlessly hopeful humanity that we see in ourselves. The tavern stands as monument to that humanity, in all its ugliness and beauty, its cruelty and compassion, its despair and hope. It is where medieval Europe truly lived, in the spaces between the grand narratives of kings and battles and cathedrals, in the daily struggle of ordinary people to survive and to make that survival mean something more than mere existence. And in that struggle, filthy and desperate and violent as it often was, there is a nobility that transcends the circumstances. The nobility of the human spirit refusing to be broken, building community out of scraps, finding connection in the darkest places, enduring. The medieval tavern was filthy. But it was also, in its way, magnificent.